Welcome to the Empire, buddy. This is Rampart, and welcome to another interview for Project Renaissance, the fan-made spiritual successor for Medieval 2, where today I'm here with Lionheart, where I wanted to pick his brain about multiple different aspects as we are developing this project. So I'll pass it over to him so he can introduce himself and say hi.
Hey guys, I'm Lionheart, and I've been making Total War videos, Let's Plays, campaigns, battles, showcases, things like that for about 14 years now. Over on my YouTube channel and also stream over on Twitch, and I just love the opportunities that Total War gives you to either recreate history or go off on a different path and diverge and form your own histories and things like that, and the stories and the role play that you get to experience that way, and of course the battles that are still, there's nothing close to it in any other game series.
Oh yeah. So for today, what some of the thoughts we're going to first start off with is, so I think with start with that, because some of the things I was thinking about was campaign lengths, political systems, and campaign stances, but also with talking about battles initially, there was another idea that has been recently circulating through the team that I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on. It's a way that we've been thinking about to try and make experience matter for units, but not have it be too overpowered. And one thought we've been having to differentiate between different tiers of units is having passive abilities / traits that are unlocked through experience. Or the best example I can think of is like a morale shock resistance trait. You could see this being on a higher tier unit. Because you want to make sure that your high tier units feel impactful. But we've been thinking about the idea of, besides just experience giving you better attack stats or defense stats or whatever your units do, also possibly allowing passive traits to be unlocked. Because I know I really want to be able to have it so that people can care about their units. And so that's been kind of a thing that we've been playing around with, and I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
I already like the idea of passive kind of like unlocks like that for, you say, like morale shock stuff. More hardened veteran troops would be more resistant to being charged because they're veterans, they're used to being in the thick of it. So that feels like a really kind of natural way of exploring experience and showcasing veteran units in the field and bits and pieces like that. I should say, actually, before we go any further, I just want to actually very quickly say thank you to you and your team for doing this.
Yeah.
Because I think, not just within the current state of the Total War community, but a lot of fans for a very long time have wanted something like this. And it's honestly, I'm blown away. It's phenomenal with, the what you guys are attempting to do here. And I'm very excited to see every single update and post that you guys make, watching this kind of grow and develop further.
I really appreciate hearing that, especially because I know I'm one of those fans that was sitting in that group of like, hey, can we get something like this, or can we please get more historical? And it's just, I finally decided, well, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it myself.
Yeah, I'll do it myself. Yeah.
So that's the whole point, because like I've been in this. I haven't been doing my YouTube stuff nearly as long as you have. Technically, I've been doing it almost 10 years now, technically, although it's only been recently that my channel's been doing more. But even still, like, I've loved this game franchise. I want it to do well, and when it doesn't feel like it's going in a direction that I think will serve the community as best as I want it to, I will do that myself, even though it's an ambitious as hell thing.
Yeah, but I think that, as you say, like the whole community as a whole, like we don't want Total War to fail and do poorly. We want it to succeed, but if it means doing it yourself and kind of hopefully showing them what can be done, what should be done, and what the community wants, if they're no longer seeming to kind of like listen, then these kinds of projects, I think I'm hoping that not only does it succeed for you guys, but I'm also hoping that you are able to challenge CA to a degree where they go, yeah, we actually need to really rethink what are our core design pillars here, because the community's doing it better.
Yeah. And this is a very random tangent, but something that I'm just reminded of, because I've been playing through Assassin's Creed Valhalla recently just on my own, And it just kind of reminds me about how similar to Total War, I think some other game series, oftentimes they just kind of lose sight of originally what was so drawing to them. Like with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I miss the like linear storytelling of like the Ezio game, the Assassin's Creed 2, all the way to Revelations. And with Total War, I know I've talked about this in some of the other interviews, there's kind of a dumbing down or convenience of systems that makes sense on like why you'd want to have just all these really convenient systems, but they kind of take away at the core of what made Total War so enjoyable sometimes.
Yeah.
Like for me, replenishment's the easiest example for me. Replenishment, it's very convenient, but it really hurts the how you care about your battles.
Yeah, nothing's meaningful if you can just, park your army for a turn or two maximum and they're back up to full strength. You need impactful losses, need to be impactful, and I think as well that also leads into other systems that, because replenishment's so streamlined and convenient now, it's why we don't get any further development on growth mechanics or population, because none of those things matter to replenishment anymore, but they should do, because not just from that's how things actually work historically, but also just in the real world, but also that's to a degree what we had in the likes of Rome 1 and Medieval 2. Your population, drawing from that population, reflected what you could then have as your military force as well, and that linked the whole kind of society, economic and military pillars all together. And we've lost that, and I understand why they streamline certain things to make it more accessible, make it more approachable, but my kind of advocacy for all of this is I don't necessarily mind if they streamline certain bits, but they've then got to add depth layers for players that want the additional depth, they want the additional features. I am all for them streamlining certain things that means that more players can easily access the series and get stuck in. But for the veterans that have played a couple of Total War games or been playing since the start, we then need additional layers or additional options that we can configure that give us that more complex system. I mean, I don't know about you, but I always think it's funny, I guess, when you see a bit of marketing, or I guess when perhaps other people refer to Total War as a grand strategy. I don't think it is. I don't think it's ever been a grand strategy, because I don't think there's ever been that much depth to facilitate that. I mean, maybe the original Total Wars were closer to that, especially with some of the kind of campaign side of things. But I just don't consider them. I consider them strategy games, but I don't consider them grand strategies. Something like that I'd say is Crusader Kings.
Yeah, I always just strategy, never grand strategy for me.
Yeah, I think it's a really obvious answer. It's just there's not enough depth there. There are in places that I think they've shown throughout the Warhammer series in particular, and to a degree a little bit with Pharaoh, that they can build in a wide array of campaign mechanics that can have some depth and can have unique flavors to them. And I think that is probably one of the kind of redeeming parts of that development. But everything else has been completely left behind or streamlined to a point where you are, 2 menus deep at any point, and that's it. And I'm not saying we should have depth just for the sake of having a deep game and no one wants to be buried in menus, but you want additional options and management. And I think the future of the series has to get deeper across the board, because otherwise it's gonna fizzle out, or it's just gonna keep plodding along doing exactly the same thing that the last 10 years have done.
Because I know that's one thing that why like Baldur's Gate 3 has been such a huge thing recently, because Larian Studios, they found out what worked with them with Divinity Original Sin and all that, and they slowly refined the process over time to eventually then get to the point where they developed Baldur's Gate 3. It doesn't feel like any of the progress and development between Total Wars actually matters. They all feel so self-contained that even if there's some sort of innovation in one game, it's never carried over to the other. And that's something I know I've been trying to keep in mind and I want to focus on with this project is I want to try and just build a good foundation, or focusing on wanting it to be starting in the medieval / kind of Renaissance area. But the idea is supposed to be that like we could get a foundation here. And it's been joked about, hey, do you guys want to make a fan-made Empire 2 as well? And if I can get the foundationals set up right, that you can just be like, okay, we can take all these features that we've been able to expand on, or we've hammered these out. Now we can try and continue to expand on them in other titles too. Because I know for myself, I think, and this is what I've been thinking about so often with some of the more recent Total Wars, is there was a very similar issue with, I'm a huge World of Warcraft fan, that the system design for some more recent games is so just data driven that they're just trying to make these perfectly balanced systems that are supposed to be designed to just make fun, as opposed to more organic, like very simple systems that add depth because there's so many tiny little simple things to add together, as opposed to all these complicated systems that is supposed to technically be very engaging, but at times there's a very easy way to game the system. I know for me, one thing I've been thinking about recently, and this actually kind of goes back to one of the other things I wanted to try and talk about, was I've been playing a lot of Attila recently because of the Medieval Kingdoms 1212 mod. And I've been seeing the political system of Attila again. I've been engrossed in that again. And I've been reminded of so much about how it's so different to Medieval 2, where Medieval 2, it's a very kind of passive system, where there can be some political intrigue, especially if you play the Stainless Steel Historical Improvement Project. I think that has like the best version of the Medieval 2 political system. But Attila can be gamified so much. There's so many things you can technically do with the resources that you have available to try and manage your control and your dominion and all of that. But at some point, it's just a very gamified system of, oh, well, I'm just going to, in my campaign right now, I just keep castrating my other lords to make them not have enough influence. And that's all I'm doing is, oh, we're trying to get you guys to have loyalty. Well, I'm castrating you. I'm just using my lord a lot to get him the most influence and just stack all the items to give him more influence. And it's like, okay, well, now I don't have to worry about this because it's so mathematically driven that as soon as I figure out what's the optimal way to play, well, there's not as much
no point.
Yeah,
there's no point doing anything else. I think the same. Yeah, between the especially when Rome 2 eventually had its kind of politics update. I know quite a lot of people got excited about it, but I always looked at it going, well, it feels like there's like 20 odd buttons that they've now added in here, but there's only 3 of them out of these 20 that are ever worth pressing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, it's like, okay, it looks like you've added some depth in, but actually there's only 2 things I'm actually going to click on and ever need to do to just manage this whole system. I think it's because probably something like that, you need not just the I think all those options would have worked potentially if you then actually had dynamic characters as well, kind of constantly vying and upsetting stuff. Because like you were saying, if you're just able to go through and castrate all those characters, what you need is that if you do that to 2 in a row or whatever, you need almost something like in Crusader Kings where then a faction gets developed to overthrow you, because obviously they're upset that their mates have just had themselves neutered.
Yep.
So you need to have you had to have some reaction to the player's input, not just being able to go, yeah, I'm just gonna neuter every single one and now they're all really obedient. I mean, that's not really what's going to happen, is it? Unless you're able to kind of round everyone up and then push them all through in one big go. If you do that a couple of times, people are going to be upset about it, and they're going to want, that's when you might want like a law system that comes in and they're going to push for some demands or something like that. And if you don't, then they're going to rise up against you. And that's just like, if, as you say, it feels like it's almost like know that they could make all these separate features, because they often do, but they actually need to then tie them all together so that they actually have some input and response to every potential option the player puts in. They need some more dynamic events and reaction from what the player is doing, rather than you going, well, I can game the whole system here because I know it's not going to react to any of these things I do, so I'm just going to go for the most powerful decision, which is this one, every single time.
And I know that's one of the reasons why I have an issue with the idea of just blanketly trying to take the systems that, like Crusader Kings 3 with its events that can happen and all the different decisions you can have. If you just import that over to Total War without any changes of how the AI interacts, it would like it would kind of solve a little bit of how the game feels. I know the Empire Total War 2 extended mod kind of does that because they introduce some events like that. But because
Yep.
the AI doesn't really interact with them, it's kind of a band-aid. That's all
Yeah,
it is.
it's all for kind of the benefit of the player of having those extra options and dilemmas and stuff. And I mean, it's something that I said when we first had kind of more like choose your own adventure events popping up in Warhammer 1, and that developed through 2 and 3. Those are great for the player in terms of role play and feeling like there's a bit more going on in the map. But if the AI never does anything back to you, or it doesn't impact that, it's like, yeah, it's nice to kind of pick my own adventure, but it's not actually having that much impact. So rather than me picking the one that maybe thematically is interesting or makes sense, I'm just going to choose that one because that one gives me the most gold or the most units or the most powerful result. And we need to have more triggers to things firing off, causing the AI to respond in different ways to offer more challenge. And then I guess ultimately, if the AI is more challenging, then we don't need it to be kind of propped up by having overinflated buffs and boons versus the player to make it have this perceived challenge, when actually no, it's just the fact that it can field 10 armies to every 2 of yours, which is okay the first few times, but afterwards, again, the player then can go, right, well, I know not to do that and that, or I'll just do this and this, and it's the same story every single time.
Yeah, because I know for myself, the AI feeling like they're always playing by some sort of different rules is like one thing that I know for me, when I first was playing Attila when it first came out, that was really disjointed for me. Is when I found a mod at one point that's like, hey, it's gonna get rid of the passive income for the AI and the player too, and it's like, wait, the game feels so much more balanced now because the AI can field a similar number of armies that I can, and I don't feel like I am just being targeted for the sake of being targeted, because that's not just similar to the fact that I'm a huge D&D player, and the way you have to play your NPCs or the way you have to interact with your AI or whatever, you don't want them to be necessarily too smart, that because then that's not necessarily that enjoyable. My roommate is currently trying to do an escort quest and in Baldur's Gate 3, and the AI is immediately murdering the escorts because he's on the hardest difficulty right now. And you have to have a little bit of a balance of the AI is making somewhat intelligent decisions to try and take advantage of and deal with the player, but it's not in a manner that is. I still remember my Grimgore campaign where I had 4 or 6 armies following me through the mountains, just chasing my armies, and that's all they were doing. It's like, I know you're trying to kill me, but it's too obvious that you're trying to kill me, instead of trying to make intelligent decisions for yourself. Like, you're taking attrition chasing me through the mountains. I know you have a death sentence for me, but like, what the hell? That's not that engaging.
And the thing is I don't think it's necessarily that they don't even have the tools of how the AI could react to make it more challenging, because I think something like that, an option of, if the AI can see that you're going up through the mountains, so through the database it knows or whatever, we take attrition if we move there, well then don't follow it. Either then spread out, start harassing, raiding the player's territories to lure them back in, or I mean, I would genuinely be terrified for a day that the AI is chasing my armies, but stops chasing me because I go off into the mountains or somewhere they're going to take attrition, and then they all go into ambush stance. They disappear. That would be truly terrifying, because I'd be like, where have those armies gone? Because then that also requires me to put a new input in, which is, right, I've got to try and find those armies. Now, do I pull my army back and risk it? Well, I don't want to do that. So have I got any agents that I can send to scout things out, reveal what's going on? Do I send a smaller force to find out where they are? That one change of using an existing mechanic, which is just change the stance that the army's in, go into ambush and wait here and see if we can lure them back, immediately changes up the dynamic. But as you say, it often feels like all the AI can do is follow and chase the player, rather than look at, well, how can we, if we can't lock onto just the army, well, let's go destroy his cities, let's go raid his income, let's harass his trade partners. The options are there, but I think has kind of been the reoccurring theme that we've hit on already, is that there doesn't seem to be anywhere near enough systems, if any, talking to each other within the game. They're
Hmm.
all there, but if they started talking to one another and utilizing the mechanics that are already there, that would in itself, without any additional content or depth added, that would add in a lot more challenge naturally, that I think a lot of players would probably enjoy.
Yeah, because I know for myself, that's something that I always feel pretty good about with going back to Medieval 2 is the AI feels a lot better at using all the systems that are in place. The AI actually assassinates your generals sometimes. They'll actually use their priests to convert other priests, get rid of heretics. Well, not always heretics, but they always use the merchants. They do take advantage of the terrain far. I've been ambushed more often in Medieval 2 than I have ever been in Warhammer 3, honestly.
Yep. Yep.
And it's just because I know it's because the systems are technically more simplified in the older Total Wars, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you have a lot of
No.
small simple systems, they can compound on each other and make things more complicated overall.
Yeah. As you say, like I don't think necessarily either of us are saying we need really, as I said, deep, many menus, layered systems added in, but we need lots of simple, straightforward systems that interact with one another and offer that more challenging experience because they're kind of straightforward and simple. But there's just they add more variations to what can possibly happen. And I agree. Actually, I many well, I say a fond memory. It's not a fond memory of just getting my armies ambush walking through forests in Medieval 2 than I ever have done in the Warhammer series. The only time it really catches you off guard and is maybe, well, I guess enjoyable, but then frustrating is when Zinch teleport strikes on top of you and triggers an ambush.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you know what? I at times I'm kind of like, actually, I don't mind that the Zinch AI seems to do that a lot to you because that's thematic for them, and it forces me to play very differently when I know I'm facing those factions on the map because they could come out of anywhere. So that in itself changes the dynamic a little bit, but we need that across the board, not just one faction having that, that slight change in stance, preference, and focus.
Yeah, and that's a very apt example because I just had an army get slaughtered in my Cedric campaign the exact way.
Yeah.
um, and I know for myself, this is just kind of why leading back. There's like a lot of design decisions we're trying to think of. Is we want to make sure that the AI is going to have to consider this as well, and that's why I'm leaning more towards a lot of passive abilities as opposed to active abilities. I know for myself, one thing that over the years, because I know Shogun 2 is probably the best example of when they really started to focus on this a lot, is when you have all these different activated abilities on your general, and it does add more choice, but I think it somewhat bloats all the decision making, and it's like, okay, there's so many things I could do at so many different times, and I don't mind having those, but I think it's better to somewhat just have more passive abilities more often than not. Um, it does it kind of slightly reduce the skill ceiling somewhat, making it so you have less activated abilities so that you can activate at just the right time. But I know one thing we've been thinking about, and I know this was in Three Kingdoms as well, a suppression effect. Making it so that that is something that archers have, so that when they're firing on other archers or other infantry, there's a suppression effect of, oh, they're, well, hey, we're going to feel like shit if we're being shot at by our arrows, even if you are the most veteran soldier. You might occasionally be like, well, shit, Fred just died next to me. I need to be careful that there's fire on me. And that's like just another, again, example of another small little system to add on. That it's not that crazy. It's just one little thing. Like, oh, this is a debuff this archer unit will apply to other people. Nothing too crazy
Yeah.
about that, but when you add that into other, like that will be a great incentive. Hey, my guys are being shot at. I need to have a cav unit go stop those archers so that my other units are more effective.
Yeah, and likewise, it gives you that benefit of saying, well, aside from just the range advantage, what else can I do with these archers? And it gives you that opportunity that if you're up against something that's a bit more heavily armored, that you can't do the direct damage. Well, there's still the morale impact, and the fact that you potentially, I don't know, maybe tiring them out a little bit more because they perhaps got to slow down because they've got to raise shields or what have you, if they're under fire. And that's, I mean, that is exactly what happened historically with longbowmen and what have you. They didn't necessarily directly just flatten enemy infantry units, especially if they were heavily armored, but it did tire them out and force them to close ranks, and that again plays into so many different layers of then tactics. Well, what if you're forcing them to close ranks, that makes them a very narrow force. You can then outflank them with faster moving cavalry units, or it opens them up and exposes them to different maneuvers that you can make. And it's I think really what Total War needs to do on the battles is go back to basics of those more passive modifiers, but having lots of them, because that just gives you more ways to play. And I mean, I think back in Medieval 2, you put archers up on a hill, their range increased, so that immediately placed way more incentive to take high ground, but also just the other tactical layer of, right, I've got to scan my terrain. That made the deployment phase not just, okay, I've got to set my army about, but you're also looking about, well, where am I going to move? Where are my first few moves going to be? Because I need to take. I mean, I felt like at that I had that sense of play a bit in Empire and Napoleon, because I was constantly looking at, well, where's a good bit of terrain where I'm going to have clear line of sight and firing lines. And again, that's something that historically, generals had to very effectively pick the right spot for battle, because that had almost as much impact as the number of guns and artillery that they're bringing to the field as well. And I mean, okay, introduction in Troy and then Pharaoh of terrain modifiers again, having a little bit, but they're easily avoidable because there's never a reason to kind of go through them and interact with them, which I think you need to have more of that occurring. And yeah, because that just, battles, I think, are by far the weakest point of the Total War series as they stand. I don't think they've really changed much at all for the past 10 years easily. It's just, well, what mechanics do we need within battles to fit the historical setting or the fantasy setting that we're involved with now. I mean, the biggest change to battles are the inclusion of magic in the Warhammer series, and then probably the small, reintroduction of terrain effects in Troy and Pharaoh, and potentially Pharaoh's a few of its stances that it's introduced, which I think are a good thing. I don't think they're perfect, but I feel like they're small features that, as you say, add to the overall experience, and that's more of what we need. And I mean, I just really hope that eventually at some point, and I hope it's something you guys do with battles, is that having loose and tight spacing as just a standard bit option that you can choose again to give you that tactical opportunity. I don't know why that disappeared. I mean, I think in Three Kingdoms you started having it come back, but they said it wouldn't be you wouldn't have tight spacing available on your peasant units because it was meant to reflect that they were a disorganized rabble. But I struggle with that. Like, I get where they're trying to argue with that. Yeah, they're going to be disorganized. They're not going to suddenly form a very complex military formation. But that if you're about to be charged by something, you're probably going to brace up. And likewise, if you're being shot by arrows, you're probably going to space out and take cover. So I don't see why those are, restricted features, or in more recent Total Wars, we just don't have them. I think those should be adding in tight, loose spacing, adding in some stances as well. I mean, I think again, they're not perfect in Pharaoh, but it's one of the few things that I genuinely quite enjoy about it is the push forward stance or the actual retreat stance. That's something I think is actually probably overlooked, because I mean, well, Pharaoh itself is overlooked and kind of rightly so given the state of everything. But the fact that you can, on some of the units, you have that that pull back stance option where they try and form up facing the enemy, still fighting, but then slowly but surely retreat back and reverse out of combat. That's huge.
Oh yeah,
because that's how you would withdraw a unit from combat if you wanted to still use it. If the unit's broken, then yeah, it's just going to turn around and everyone's going to flee in all sorts of different directions. There's not going to be any kind of cohesion to it. But if you've still got command of that unit, if it's still disciplined and still got its morale, you're going to form up, face a solid line against the enemy, and slowly reverse, step by step out of there, so that if the enemy does try and chase you, you're still facing them ready to fight. And I mean, I think the only thing that's come close to showing this, and I do wonder maybe if CA saw the Manalord videos where they were showing off stances a couple of years ago, and I wonder if that inspired them to put the similar features in Pharaoh.
Possibly.
Because seeing those in Manalords, I don't think there was a single comment that referenced Total War that didn't say something like, we've wanted this in Total War for years, this is phenomenal, that's what we want. And it's like, battles are never gonna, I don't think they're ever gonna change through one or two big features. They're going to be changed through, and they're going to be developed forward and improved by lots of little additions. Terrain has to have more of an impact. It has to, have variations on line of sight, range, cover, whatever. I mean, to be honest, that's maybe that's something depending on the historical period that needs to then start coming into Total War, which is cover. I think the only time we ever had that was in Empire and Napoleon, a little bit with walls that you could form up against. And I mean, there was the whole plan of Rome 2 having lots more interactable buildings, but in the end we only got one or two models, I think, that actually made it through where you could put units into them. But again, that's another key feature where the series needs to develop through kind of more minor, smaller changes, and then you just include more of those things on the battlefield that you can then interact with, because then it makes, I mean, saying something like Napoleon Total War and looking at the various farmhouses that were fought over at the Battle of Waterloo. If you didn't have those, that's an entirely different battlescape. But the fighting was so fierce on those farm points, and the way that they couldn't even give or take any ground there because it was so brutal. That's what we need, that evolution of having those points, because even medieval armies, if they find a defensible position, they're gonna try and fortify it up and hold it if they realize it's good ground to hold, if it's got a tactical advantage. But in the Total War games, you never have that. You never go, oh, that's a good bit of ground that I've got there's an advantage if I take and hold that. It's more, oh, probably I'm caught out of place from the rest of my army, I'll fall back and give the ground again.
Yeah, I have not cared nearly as much about my army placement in more recent Total Wars, especially Warhammer 3, as much as I did in Medieval 2. Because part of it is the fact that we don't have procedural generated maps anymore. And you just see the same areas over and over and over again. And so with Warhammer 3, it's like, okay, I'm on this siege map. Well, this is the area that has the least amount of tower coverage. I'm going to go here and assault from this area. Oh, this is the same Chaos Waste area that has like a slightly elevated spot. Okay, I'm going to go set up here because it kind of gives me some advantage in the elevation department. But it's like, okay, well, it's just the terrain doesn't matter nearly as much. And I think this is in the campaign map and the battle map for me in the more recent Total Wars, especially with Warhammer 3. Because I know for myself the fact that and I know it's just because of the Warhammer 3 where there's like the tunneling stance where you can go through mountains, like that makes it so, hey, mountain passes don't matter as much, or the fact that for me personally, I really struggle with caring about stances in more recent Total Wars because the toggles are not that immersive to me. That's like one thing that kind of I struggle with. It's like, okay, I can force march. It does make it so my armies get to places sooner, but it's not that engaging because I'm just doing a toggle. The best example is really ambush stance. Ambush stance from previous Total Wars made me care so much more about where I was on the map because the ambush stance wasn't automatic. I know there has to be like a balance of wanting to be able to like force an ambush because you would be able to occasionally do that, but in more recent Total Wars, it's like, okay, well, let's see which area has a 100% ambush chance. That's all I'm caring about.
Yeah. I mean, it's something. Fondly with Medieval 2, and even now when I'm playing like Third Age and Divide and Conquer, I'm looking for forests that I know I can set up an ambush by that's nearby the road or something like that. And it's again, that gives you that tactical layer of terrain on the campaign map layer because you're specifically choosing, okay, I could walk straight at the enemy, but I actually want to try and pick off their forces along the way. I'm going to take this alternative route here because there's more forest, so I know I can ambush there. And yeah, as you say, like just because there isn't any direct cover doesn't mean that you couldn't set up some kind of ambush. But I think it wouldn't necessarily hurt it to actually get rid of the ambush stance and make it so that you have to like enter a patch of trees on the map, and then that's where your ambush then sets up again.
Yeah, because I know for me, I like the idea of the stances, but I think there are better ways to implement them that are more engaging than just a toggle. For example, like raiding stance. Okay, I'm now raiding this area. Instead, and this is kind of the reason why we've been leaning towards the kind of settlement system we're going to go with, is to incentivize, that you're raiding this territory. Well, there's just a bunch of like little minor settlements, kind of similar to, I think, Thrones of Britannia, I think, actually had that too, actually, where there was like the minor settlements and the major settlements that were kind of linked to each other, but essentially incentivizing the player. Oh, hey, if I want to hurt my economy of my enemy, let me just go raid this. Actually, I think Bannerlord's the better example. Bannerlord's by far the better example, actually, in that instance. Let me go raid this tiny little city to then cause damage here to make money. One thought I've had is with Force March stance, have it so you can just move normally, but then also we have been thinking about how would we maybe do like a supply system. Part of me has been thinking maybe the way you could technically have a more engaging Force March stance is, you've done your normal movement. If you want, you could use some supplies to try and give you more movement again. So essentially kind of to try and simulate Force March stance, but you're more actively engaged in it.
Yeah, like burn through some reserves and some supplies, because again, that creates you've got to manage your supply element to it, and also that makes that more of an impactful decision than just going, I'm going to click on this stance button and change the Force March one. It's like, well, yeah, I could still choose a stance like that, but I've also got to take into account the supply resource, and weigh up whether if I do this, am I going to have enough resources to get back without taking attrition or what have you to my force, or is that then going to have a negative impact where if I run out of supplies, am I then going to be able to move less of a distance and potentially be caught out by the enemy?
Ambush stance, I think, is one of the easiest ones to think about on how to make it more engaging, but not have it be just the toggle. I think you just need more areas that are considered ambushable, because I really appreciated in Medieval 2 just the little forests. Like, that's a very engaging thing. Like, makes me think about the map more. Just having like more little areas that are associated with being ambushable, I think that's the simplest way to do that, because it feels so satisfying in Medieval 2. Like, okay, I'm gonna walk over here. Okay, my guy's crouching. Awesome. I can tell that if anybody gets near me, and also the AI even uses it too, so it feels even better to know that the AI will also use this too.
Yeah.
That, hey, I'm taking in consideration my terrain, and I'm now trying to set up an ambush. That is kind of the more active way to set it up.
And I think that layers into stuff like with Medieval 2, because then it would be satisfying if you knew there were lots of forests on this route and you'd lost track of an enemy army. You'd then send a spy out to check some forests to see if you could discover the enemy army hiding, and then you would launch your own counterattack. You've caught them by surprise. I think that's far more of an engaging, kind of almost like side quest that you hadn't planned on doing because you were just going to go for that target, but you'd seen that army, it disappeared, you'd found it, and then before we can attack the main settlement, we need to take out this army, otherwise it's going to try and ambush us, or it's going to break the siege that we're going in for. So I think just already that adds in an additional kind of round of play, or an additional layer to consider
I think
when you're utilizing it.
I think the only stance I don't mind that I actually could just keep it as a toggle is encampment stance. Encampment stance is one of the only ones that makes sense to me, and it's like, oh, okay, we're going to set up and we're going to fortify this position, and what you get from the fortifying position, that's kind of the thing that we're still kind of playing around, because, like, do we add... I know one thing that I've been trying to consider about is I like the Medieval 2 recruitment system. It makes me care about my units more. But, and I think mainly this would actually be taking more inspiration from Third Age, there has to be a somewhat of a convenient way to be able to retrain. Third Age has its way stations, which I really appreciate. I think that's just a really good way to go about it. But also, I've played around the idea of... would it be engaging to be able to have a system where it's like, okay, you set up for a couple turns, an encampment stance, basically kind of say, signal, hey, we need reinforcements. We're going to set up here for a couple turns, and if you sit there for a few turns, you get your full replenishment. Kind of hit or miss on whether or not that's something that we would want to do, but it's...
I think if it wasn't instant, it took a few turns to build up, that would all... I think that's kind of a fair representative. I think it's when it's instant replenishment, you know, the next turn. Whereas if you need to do it for sort of 3 or 4 turns, that then again plays into the player having to make that conscious choice of, well, the only other way would be to send that specific unit back to a settlement to fully retrain it if there's, you know, population available, unit limits or whatever. Or do we hunker down and essentially we've sent out messengers to bring up the reserves, you know, from the city as such. And I think if encamp stance takes a while before it kicks in, that'd be fine. I've always wondered with encamp stance, would it be something that would be interesting to... the more turns you're encamped, the more fortified the position becomes. So the first turn you encamp, it's just a few pitch tents and what have you, with, you know, 1 or 2 little sentries. If they're there because they've decided they're going to winter in that position or what have you, or they're really going to hunker down and hold a protracted defense of a position or something like that, then they start, you know, erecting small little palisades and things like that, up to a point where, I mean, I loved it in Medieval 2 where you could choose to build a fort on a location, and I almost wonder if maybe encamping could potentially lead to something like that, where you've got to almost kind of break the ground first and get it as a solid defensible position, and then you can transform that into a permanent defensive position that you can then garrison with additional troops or what have you over time.
And I know for myself, I would love that, because I know one thing I always kind of felt weird with Rome 2 and Attila most specifically. It's like, hey, they went into encampment stance, and now they immediately have a fort with activatable towers instantly. And it's like, okay, that's a little on the nose, and kind of feels a bit interesting that they built this up so quickly. But I would love being able to do that. I know for myself, I want to be able to have it so we can, at least for sure, build forts again. I've been debating on whether or not we should have it so that there is buildable watchtowers, because for me, I love my glorified watchtower builders in Medieval 2. I do. It's more engaging to explore the map for me, and I know I lean technically more towards like what was done in Shogun 2 for the map, because I think there is the added mystery of not knowing the entire map makes things more engaging, as opposed to like in Warhammer, you just see the entire world. Like, it's technically kind of fog covered over in fog, but you can still see the entire map. It's one of the reasons why the Americas campaign for Medieval 2 I loved not being able to see anything, and then I have to slowly explore that.
Yeah, and I think that plays into the experience though as well, because that was quite reflective of the fact that those European armies that would have been landing had no idea of what they were walking into. They had no idea of the land masses really. They knew there was land in that direction and that direction, but they didn't know what was coming out of the fog of war. I think that all plays into it quite well. But yeah, no, I mean, I would love to be able to just go around and place watchtowers as well. And it's always, whenever I go back and play stuff like Third Age, it's always a guaranteed comment. It's like, Lionheart, you need to be building watchtowers. I'm like, yeah, I've forgotten because I'm so out of practice, because this is the last game where they had that in.
I think the stainless steel mod had a pretty good way about it, because you could have a toggle with the settings for stainless steel where it's like, oh, do you just want to have permanent watchtowers already like built up around the map?
Yeah.
Or you could just build them yourselves. I kind of appreciate that. I think that's almost like a good middle ground in some regard.
Yeah.
Okay. One other thing I know that I want to talk about, because I'm not sure how much longer we're going to go on for, is I'm curious about getting your thoughts on campaign lengths. Like, because especially since you're a campaign player, you've completed so many campaigns. Essentially, how would you like campaign lengths to be targeted, I guess? Like, would you just prefer that there's always an option to have like short campaign or long campaign? Or is there any way you think that maybe Total War can improve on that, because I think that's one of the things that, and I think they've even struggled with this to figure out like what's the most rewarding way for people to have their campaigns. But I'm just
Yeah,
that's like the one thing, because I love long campaigns. I've done
yeah.
so many world conquests, but I know not everybody likes that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of campaign length, I don't think there should ever necessarily be a, like here's a shorter campaign, here's a longer campaign. I think there should be the campaign length is the period that you're playing within. I think it's all down to the objectives that kind of craft where your jumping off point wants to be. If you just want to play it for the short victory objective, then you can just do that. If you want to play for the long victory objective, you can keep playing past that. But what matters with those is that those have to be engaging objectives, and they have to be unique and interesting and varied across the different factions and what have you, so that you want to play those different length campaigns, or rather those different length objectives. So I quite like that. I guess with some factions now in Warhammer 3, you have short campaign giving you a small series of buffs, or the ones actually I don't really particularly like the buffs, but I quite like, I think it's with Chaos Dwarves, they unlock some additional items for you, which I think is quite a nice little reward that inspires you to kind of keep playing for the other objectives if you weren't that bothered, because you're like, well, I want to see these items out in battle. Okay, you know what are the long victory objectives? I need to conquer this faction, take these. Okay, yeah, I'll go do that, and I'll use this new gauntlet of power that I've picked up or something like that. I think that's a nice way of doing it, at least within the Warhammer Fantasy side of things. I think, yeah, there should always be that shorter objective and the longer objective, whether that's just one singular long one, or whether there's then domination or full map conquest or whatever, however you want to do it. But I think it all comes down to how the objectives and whether there's missions that give you just gentle nudges towards them where needed, or where and when you don't want to interact with them. So I don't think you shouldn't ever be railroaded to just those objectives. You always want to have that sandbox experience, but have that opportunity that when you want to dip in and push towards some of those objectives, it's fairly straightforward to achieve. But I think by and large where the Total War series is at now, I think they've got the early game down fairly well in terms of keeping players engaged through it.
Oh yeah.
And I think weirdly at the other end of the spectrum, they've kind of got that down, at least with the kind of end game crisis events that you can customize when they fire off, and you can choose how many of them come in. I think they've worked out how to offer quite a fairly scary sounding, at least, and often looking experience at the end of a Warhammer 3 campaign. I think it's often that middle ground area where you lose players. And I mean, the biggest issue with, say, like Warhammer 3 right now is that most players obviously playing Immortal Empires because it's the bigger, better map experience.
Yep.
Is that they need to do, and I think this needs to come in the next patch, really, because it's something you need doing sooner. Is they need to do a full pass across every single faction, every single lord, and give them their own slightly different, unique objectives. And also just do another pass round, because lots of lords have been moved around and their objectives no longer make sense from where they were in Mortal Empires from Warhammer 2. But because that's where a campaign lives or dies, at least with how I approach campaign, it's in a way it's kind of similar to how I approach a Crusader Kings campaign. I go in Crusader Kings and I look for characters that have interesting major decisions, and I then choose my end game objective off that, because that's a game that doesn't actually have a specific objective system to play towards. It's just whatever you want to do within it. But I tend to go in and go, right, well, that one says I can reform the Holy Roman Empire. That'll be a cool end game challenge to do. That's what I'll aim for. So if Total War needs, because it doesn't have a list of options that you can pick and choose towards like Crusader Kings does, it needs to have actually some interesting objectives, because at the moment, obviously, a lot of them are all fairly similar in terms of what you need to do, and they're fairly dull. And it's like, well, that doesn't encourage me to play any differently across these different lords and races, even though some of them have got vastly different units and different faction mechanics. I'm going to do exactly the same thing because my objectives are exactly the same, or they're very similar. And I don't always think the kind of fairly kind of radical different campaign play styles work out, like the Changeling from the Shadows of Change DLC. I know that's, I feel like he's like the Marmite option. You either love him or you hate him. I don't think there's a lot of middle ground with him. I mean, I don't think I'd ever play the Changeling ever again. But I did enjoy that his campaign was all about doing these individual mini objectives that culminated and built up to these grand battle events and then the ultimate battle. That felt very refreshing for a Warhammer 3 campaign to not just be the same old, yeah, go defeat this and this. It was all these little tricks of espionage and various objectives to go and do that changed up the feel of that campaign. Despite the fact that, you know, the cult mechanics are silly because there's no challenge to it. It's basically you just kind of start and play through. But in terms of objectives, they all told different stories and made me potentially go off to different places that I wouldn't have usually thought about going to, especially with a Tzeentchian faction. So that I think a kind of campaign lives or dies on whether its objectives are engaging and interesting, and whether there are potentially either be it scripted or randomized events along the way that either help or harass the player in getting to those objectives. You know, I guess in like Medieval 2, you know, you always had like the invasions coming in towards the late game that, you know, you might be close to your victory and then suddenly the Mongol invasion comes on through or something like that, and you're completely thrown off because you've now got to scramble your front to deal with that. And obviously we have that with Chaos Invasions and Endgame Crisis, but you also had like plague events and things like that would be, you know, that would hurt your population mechanic, which in turn hurts your ability to recruit. So if you've just opened up another version of the 100 Years' War with France, that really slows you down. So
I think for myself, at least, the main reason why I think some of the more recent Total Wars don't have as nearly as engaging middle aspects of their campaigns is somewhat because there's not nearly as many sandbox opportunities, especially with betrayal. For the most part, I know I've talked about this in another interview. I loved the fact when I was playing the Tsar's Total War mod for Medieval 2, when I was trying to reform the Byzantine Empire. One of my best generals that I was using for years fighting the Ottomans was bribed by them at one point when I was just about to start like really hammering them home and finishing them off. He was bribed away, and stuff like that doesn't happen in the more recent Total Wars, and some things like that can really spice up the middle of a campaign. There's a lot of like sandbox things that just naturally happen in Medieval 2 that keep me engaged throughout the entire campaign more often than not, as opposed to what happens. Because again, for me, like, hey, I will usually only ever play like one Empire campaign as Karl Franz. Balthazar Gelt's cool, but I never really want to go through another Empire campaign because it's going to feel very similar. There's very few campaigns in Warhammer 3 that are so different that I actually will want to play through a different legendary lord of the same faction.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, unless there's some very specific, unique faction mechanics for that new lord as they come in, you tend to just kind of just bounce onto the newest race or the biggest variation from the original ones. It would be nice to a degree almost if there were far more varied options that actually you went, you know what, I'm going to play another Karl Franz campaign. Haven't you already played 5? Yeah, but the objectives are so different because there's these variations to them, or things can happen so radically different that it doesn't matter.
Like, for the example of Karl Franz, I wish there was... It's just the Empire system with that. The Elector Count system needs to be fleshed out. Like, that'd be one example of a way to improve that. Having so there's more actual back and forth with those as opposed to what there is currently.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's going to be some kind of sort of overhaul that they do in the next DLC, because you've got that's for what, Nurgle Empire and Dwarves. So hopefully it's some kind of overhaul to that system, because it's, again, they've got all the core components there, but they need to overhaul how that all interacts. And as you say, there needs to be more points at which, you know, an elector count kicks off against you because it doesn't like your actions and what the player's done, and that needs to be something you actually have to deal with, not something you can just ignore.
Mm-hmm. And since I think we'll probably be trying to ramp up anytime soon anyways, I think they kind of a good time to like bring back the idea of, I know that's like one of our main goals is try and make sure that the AI really does need to feel like they're playing by the same rule set as you, and hopefully, I know we want to try and make sure that the AI, if we're introducing a system, we want to make sure that it's a simple system that we're really refining so that the AI can understand it, and also it's meaningful. Like we want to make sure that if we're adding in a system, it has a purpose. Like if we are adding in the passive traits on units, it's because hey, there are certain effects like morale shock or suppression that are small little things that can really enhance the experience, because it's a very simple system. It's not going to take much to get set up and figured out, that can then compound with the rest of the systems in the game. Because I think it's those smaller, more nuanced systems that compound on each other that I think actually makes things more exciting and immersive over time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's, you know, sometimes it's nice to have a big new flashy mechanic, but often it's it's far more important and far more enjoyable to have lots of smaller systems all coming together and throwing out lots of different variations and options of how you can interact and how you can play, rather than one big new flashy system going, well, here's how you can interact it and here's how you can play. That's just one option. So yeah, bring on lots more little features and options and passive bits that build on one another and work together to offer that experience.
Yeah. So do you have anything else you'd want to try and say before we wrap up for now?
No, but please keep doing the amazing work you guys are doing, and I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with, because this is the future of Total War, and I hope that after all this time, CA inspiring you guys, I hope that perhaps the tables will turn and what you guys do will inspire them.
That is my hope, because I know I think this was on the video the Terminator did. There was one guy saying, well, more than likely we'll get a Medieval 3 before this ever releases, and I'm like, well, if Medieval 3 ever comes out and it's good, hell yeah. If they're ever inspired by what's done by this, sure, awesome. But if not, that's what this project's here for, to try and make sure that if that doesn't live up to expectations, we'll continue working on our own thing. But I am actually not opposed that technically. I just want CA to do well. I want them to actually improve what they've been doing and not make it feel like it's just another product to just pump out just to meet a quarterly earnings call. We want these games to be good. That's what we want.
Yeah, we want them good. We want them to take their time with it. We want a solid product, and I think you say it like I think the biggest thing is that we want them to acknowledge that the design pillars that they've had in their mind as these core Total War design pillars are very, very different in their minds to what the vast majority of the player base actually consider to be the core design pillars. Mm-hmm. And it's hopefully projects like this that are going to show actually what are the true core pillars of a Total War title and an experience that players actually want. And okay, they're not completely off the mark, but they are drumming in their own pillars so much that they're not looking up and seeing what the community is telling them and what the community is actually asking for and wanting to see developed and taken further forward. I mean, the kind of CA kind of buzzword at the moment is that they need to communicate better, they need to listen better, and they need to not just internally communicate better but externally as well. And hopefully this project and others like it kind of force their hand. That we need them to listen, and if they won't read and listen, then you guys will show them.
Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons why I know for this entire project I'm trying to be very open with communication on how the development is going. I'm hoping that the week after this is uploaded, we should be able to have another development update showcasing more of our battle prototype. That's my hope, because I want to make sure that's
Fantastic.
a very open system on this, because I think I know a lot of people are maybe just overlooking this possibility. It's like, oh, this is just too ambitious, not going to really see much from it until we just continue showing consistent small little updates. That's the most important thing, and that's the hope, because I think communication is insanely important, especially in this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of the success that kind of Manor Lords has had with all the bits that, you know, the devs have just from right from the off have shown lots of you know, clear communication, lots of little dev updates, and they've shown off and teased bits where they can of what they're working on, and then been so receptive to the feedback along the way, or explaining their position on why certain choices are made certain ways. So yeah, I think hopefully we're you know, in a period now where at least those kind of passion projects, or those smaller development teams, really kind of do lead the way in communicating the vision that they have, but also, you know, engaging and finding out from their their potential player base of what the vision is that they want to meet as well. And it's refreshing to see that you kind of meet in the middle approach, rather than, no, this is how we're doing it, we're not changing for anything, it's really bad, but we're not you know, I appreciate that there's going to be a time where designers are going to be like, well, no, we want to do things very specifically this way because of X, Y, and Z. But we very often, with not just CA, but most kind of larger game studios, you just basically get told, we're developing it this way, it's immovable, doesn't change, that's it.
Like, I know for me, the replenishment thing is the biggest thing. Like, that's like one thing I know I really want to go away from replenishment, but I understand the convenience of replenishment, and I want to try and consider how can we move away from replenishment but still try and consider some sort of convenience around this system, so it's not just an annoyance. We don't want it to be an annoyance. It's just there's a theme that we're trying to showcase it by developing it in a specific way, but don't want to focus so much on that theme to forget about the player experience around this.
Yeah, that sounds ideal.
Mm-hmm. But I am going to thank you, Lionheart, for joining me for this. I really appreciated this discussion. For anybody that that was watching this, feel free down in the comments to list down any ideas that you guys kind of maybe wish we would have talked about, and things just kind of discussed in the comments, as that's one of my favorite parts about reading these interviews, reading the comments about these interviews, is just seeing what kind of things people ideas spark from what we talk about, and it really gives me some good insight into, like, oh, it's a litmus test of like what we're considering for this project, seeing how people react to what we've talked about. But I'm gonna thank you for joining me here, and I will hope that everybody enjoyed this video, but I will see you guys all next time.